Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers. With me today is Pia Lauritzen, philosopher, writer, and the founder of Qvest. One of the things that I really found interesting, when we were, thinking about bringing Pia on, is the fact that she is a philosopher. And through philosophy and asking questions, she's brought about profound impact on businesses and business leaders. And she's Danish, as is my mother. So I go to a Danish philosopher who was actually, there's a quote that's can be the front of my third book. It's Soren Kierkegaard. And one of the things it says is the most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. As an entrepreneur, what that says to me is it's not about thinking. I mean, it's great to think, it's great to have ideas, but you got to get up in the morning and do something. And you got to take control of what you are doing, what you're doing with your life, what you're doing in business. Take that first step if you're thinking about building a business or starting a business, or take that next step if you are leading a business. But you can't just sit around and wait for something great to happen. It kind of leads to me with one of the things that I say when I talk to groups, and I borrowed this in part from a speaker I heard once, and it's basically there are no brick walls, there are only sledgehammers. And I think going back to Kierkegaard and going back to the whole philosophy, philosophical approach to business, I think that's very true. Every day there's going to be things that seemingly get in your way, that seemingly make things feel difficult or impossible to do. And that's where the sledgehammer comes in. You have to have the energy, the will, the passion, above all, to pick up that sledgehammer, go through that brick wall and get to where you're going. So today with Pia, we're going to talk about philosophy. We're going to talk about questions. We're going to talk about business. And most of all, we're going to talk about breaking through that wall and doing it together through the power of questions. Pia, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Pia, one of the interesting things is philosophy, or the fact that you are recognizing yourself as a philosopher, and we both share a little bit of Danish heritage. And funnily, in my third book, I have Kierkegaard up front. I love the notion of existentialism. I love the notion of free will, and especially as an entrepreneur, I love the notion that, well, it's not a notion, it's a fact that we have to get up in the morning, choose to do something and actually achieve it, to break through those brick walls. So how does that fit into business in your mind, philosophy?
I think because it's such a huge part of being human to ask these existential questions, but also ethical questions and epistemological questions about, who are we? What does it mean to be human? How should we behave? How do we take responsibility for being human, and for being with other human beings and having an impact on the world, but also living in these AI times? How do we even know that what we think we know can be trusted is true? How do we make these basic distinctions of what is good and what is bad? Because it's such a huge part of being human, it's also a huge part of business, or it should be a huge part of business, and of understanding how to lead companies and how to deal with other human beings, whether inside the company or with customers and stakeholders at large. So I think because we're all in the business of human beings, right? So I think it's hard not to consider philosophy relevant for business as well.
It's funny, I mean, because I completely hear that. We're in this very funny time, though, where I'm not going to say that humanity doesn't seem to matter to people, but the way that we treat people, the way that we approach them, humanity seems to be lost for, I'll call it a bully pulpit. Um, does that make sense? Or
Yeah, I think we've been investing so heavily in technology for so many decades now that there is a risk that we lose touch with ourselves and what it means to be human, and why being human is something that's different from technology and from a lot of other things as well. So I can totally relate to this idea that we are losing touch with ourselves and with each other also. So there's a risk of more polarization and more because of the misinformation and because of deep fakes and all of these technological things
right,
making it harder for us to connect both with ourselves and with each other, and also on a larger scale with nature and the world we are part of, because it's actually not that difficult when we remember that we are just like everything else, living and breathing, aging, getting older, dying at some point, all of these basic laws of nature that we have to follow. Maybe AI doesn't, maybe technology can transcend some of these laws, but we can't. And when we realize that, we are confronted with the basic features of being human, and how we need to take care of ourselves and of each other, in order to reconnect with some of these basic human features.
and as you talk about that, I mean, it goes to my understanding to one of your most recent articles in Forbes, where you say AI is not an existential threat, but the humans using AI are. Can you tell us a bit more about the article?
Yeah, so I was, as a philosopher, I've been intrigued by people talking about this AI as an existential threat. I think it's interesting that technologists and business people start using a term like existential, because that's not something that we've been talking a lot about. And typically when I read about it, when I hear about it, it's like what people are afraid of is for humanity to go extinct, that we will
Right.
cease to be on this planet. And I actually don't think that that's the biggest threat. And even if it was, I don't think that's the most important thing for us to discuss at the moment. I think that what we should be discussing is this losing touch with what it means to be human, that we forget that we have a responsibility, that we have a role to play. And I made some studies when ChatGPT entered into the world in 2022. I decided I wanted to read Alan Turing to figure out what were the assumptions built into AI from the very beginning. So I was curious about looking at some of the founding fathers of AI. What were the assumptions? What were the ideas of what it means to be human, what it means to think, that were built into AI? And what I realized is that that maybe we tend to think about AI in a way that it was never meant to. AI was never meant to think like a human being. It was meant to do something else. It was meant to speed evolution up. It was meant to quicker and better get to answers than human beings can do or ever will be able to do. So knowing about the technology that was meant to do something completely different than what human beings are doing, for me, it makes it even more important that we spend the time and that we do make the investments that has not been made. We didn't make these investments for the past 70 years or something like that, in understanding what is it that makes human beings human. And we need to make some of these reconnect with that in order not to lose touch with ourselves. And comparing what I learned from Turing with what I know from some of the great philosophers, for instance, the German philosopher Martin Heidegger, just a few years after Turing wrote his article, he gave a lecture called The Question Concerning Technology. So we are back in the 1950 and 1954. And while Turing was focusing very specifically on the technology, what would the technology be able to do? Martin Heidegger was focusing on what is the impact it will have on human beings, being surrounded by technology that is so much faster and so much better at so many things. How would that impact human beings? And what he said is that we will see three things happening, three steps, so to speak. And step one is that we will lose touch with technology, meaning that we think technology can do things that it cannot do. We think it can replace us in places that it cannot replace us in. So we think we can use it as conversation partners, as girlfriends, or as doctors, or connecting with us in the same way as other human beings can, but it cannot. So that's the first thing that happens, that we lose touch with technology. The second thing is that we lose touch with reality. We cannot distinguish between what is true and what is false, and what can be trusted and what cannot be trusted. And finally, and that's the most scary thing, is that we lose touch with ourselves. So we stop trusting that we can navigate safely. We think that the technology is better at making decisions on our behalf than we are ourselves. We don't trust each other because we think that, but maybe he's just lying, he's making things up, or maybe he doesn't know as well as the machine, so I will trust the machine instead of trusting the person I'm talking to. So this three-step disillusion, where we get, it becomes harder and harder for us to connect with ourselves and our surrounding. That's what I think we should be talking about and being afraid of and trying to avoid, rather than sometime in the future being extinct.
I think one of the issues we have is we just don't seem to be able to think about two things at once. And whenever I'm working with teams, I always go to the Venn diagram, and I look for that overlap, and I build from there, because everything is about AI right now. And I'm thinking, but to your point, AI does not have, today at least, the capacity for emotional or gut intelligence. As you say, it doesn't have the human qualities. It can't read a room, it can't read emotions, and it can't store the same way that humans can our past and our experiences, and bring that to bear in what we're asking and what we're doing. Can humans actually think about two things at once, or is it just more important today to think about the argument rather than the outcomes of what we're saying and doing?
So I think we can do lots of things. I have a lot of trust in the human mind and the human ability to also to navigate things that we don't understand. I mean, one of my favorite, if not the one favorite definition I have of human beings, I found it in Friedrich Nietzsche, who said that the human being is a yet undefined animal. And I really like this definition, because it says something about the fact that we are not defined. When we are born into this world without knowing all the answers, without knowing why we are here and what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it and with whom, that makes us ask a lot of questions. And even though we don't get the answers immediately, we are able to navigate our own world and connecting with other people about finding and exploring the answers. So I think it's very deep in who we are, that we know that we don't know everything there is to know, and that makes us ask these questions and connect with each other. And that is actually a very substantial difference to AI, for instance. AI doesn't know that it doesn't know, so it has no reason to pit itself in these situations where we need to learn from each other and we need to grow together. So I think being limited in time and space, as we are as human beings, that's part of, because we have this body and we have this way of being in the world. And as I mentioned before, we are getting older, and someday we will die. And having all these limitations, we can think of it as something that makes it harder for us to grasp complexity and to navigate complexity. Or we could think of it as the exact opposite. It's because we have these limitations that we're forced to prioritize, that we're forced to spend our time wisely and to focus on the things that are most important. Instead of just thinking that if we have a machine that can answer all our questions as quickly as possible, then everything will be very much better, and maybe we can live forever, and maybe we can solve all our problems, and then what are we going to do? I think we should more think of it as, no, this is what connects us to the world we're part of, because it's like nature. It has its course, right? And then it's, things change, and it's okay. They're supposed to change, because then it makes room for other people and for other things to grow. So I think we should be careful not to think that we don't have the capacity to navigate whatever is presented to us, because we do. We are born to deal with this uncertainty and to navigate these uncertain and changing times. We just need to trust ourselves and each other to listen, I think.
And I think, and you mentioned it here, and I know this is obviously your area of expertise and research for decades, questions. And I was very interested when you said it's not about the right question, it's creating a space for everyone to ask questions. So how do we create that space and include people, empower people?
Yeah. So what I realized at some point, I was working as a management consultant, and then I also did my PhD studies in philosophy, and afterwards some postdoctoral studies, trying to find out what are these basic human features. And I was very curious about this ability to ask questions. As I mentioned, knowing that we don't know makes us ask these questions, and it's not like that's fairly unique, because if we take God, for instance, he knows everything, so there's no need to ask. And if we take animals or machines, they don't know that they don't know, so there's no reason to ask either. But we're in this middle space of in between knowing and not knowing, and so we ask all these questions. And at some point, being a management consultant, I realized that there is this tendency to monopolize questions and monopolize this power of questions. If you look in society and in organizations, we have people whose job it is to ask questions. So journalists and lawyers and teachers, and we have, it's part of their job. Whereas the rest of people living in society or working in an organization, they are turned into respondents. So their job is to respond to the questions they are asked in surveys or interviews or polls or whatever. But they are not supposed to be proactive and ask their own question, or to be interactive and ask questions of each other. So I got very curious about that, because realizing that asking questions is very, very basic for us to learn and to grow and to connect with each other, I thought it was kind of scary to realize that we tend to monopolize. So I wanted to figure out what would happen if we were able to democratize this power of questions, if we could make room for other people to ask questions. And I was experimenting just in my own family with my kids. I realized that if I ask all the questions, they stopped sharing. They were just like, just holding back, because I didn't necessarily know what to ask, what was important for them to share at the moment. So I did these small experiments, making room and just being quiet until they started saying something or asking their own questions. So I could say, oh, so this is what they care about at the moment. This is where I could, ask a bit more to help them unfold whatever's on their mind. And you could do the same in companies. So I realized that by flipping the survey logic, by saying, instead of just sending out a lot of questions for people to respond in a survey, I could make technology and methods for people, for leaders and HR people to use, where they invite people to ask each other questions about strategic topics or about something that's important to the entire company. And then starting to collect these questions and answers and seeing patterns. What do people ask? What don't they ask? Who do they turn to? Do we see some informal network patterns? Do we see some blind spots in the questions people are asking? So it's a new way of trying to see how can we use the questions people are asking and not asking to better understand what they need in order to evolve and take responsibility for whatever is on the agenda.
And when you say that, I mean, culturally in organizations and culturally by country, There must be some huge barriers. I mean, I know just, with working with companies, but also teaching students from different parts of the world and having them in the same class, questions are not exactly welcome in many cultures. So how do you start to break down that barrier?
Actually, I realized fairly early on working with these methods and these technologies that I developed that if you ask people or make room for people and invite them to ask a question, then everyone knows how to do it. But you need to protect them in the act of asking the question. So, to give you an example, when I do keynotes, I typically start out by asking people to write down a question. So I haven't said anything about what I'm going to talk about. I'm just saying I would really like you to write down a question. I only have two rules. The first rule is that the question should be relevant for the context. So the people being in this room about this topic, whatever brought us together. So it should be relevant for the context. And the second rule is that it must be something that's important for you to learn a bit more, maybe to get an answer or to explore this, to actually learn from asking this question. And these are the only two rules. And then I give people, let's say, a few minutes, 2 minutes. And what happens is it's always the same. It starts by people looking a bit confused, looking up and looking like they are searching for something. And that's exactly what I want to happen, right? I want people to connect with their inner, what am I curious about at the moment, where I am right now, to just connect with the moment they're in. And then what happens after 20 seconds or something like that is that everybody writes down something. So everybody knows how to write down a question. And it doesn't matter whether it's, a global audience or whether it's in one part of the world or the other part of the world, people know how to write down a question. And I think that's a really important lesson to remind ourselves that everyone knows how to ask questions, but we are putting ourselves and each other in a lot of situations where we don't feel comfortable doing that, where we don't think that's our job. So I also, with a colleague of mine, we developed this 7-minute game. It's called Question Jam, and it's free. So you can check it out and you can just use it. But it's a 7-minute game where you actually pick a topic as an educator or as a leader or meeting leader, project lead or whatever. You say, this is what we're going to discuss in this meeting. But let's start out by jamming, by asking each other questions anonymously on the phone for 7 minutes within the topic. So I just write down a question, I pick you, and you get the question, you respond, and you get to ask another question. And it's a way of simply making sure that whatever is in the room right now, whatever questions, whatever doubts, whatever curiosities or skepticism, that we can make room for that so questions are less dangerous. Because I think a lot of people are afraid of asking a stupid question or showing off that maybe they don't have an answer that everybody thinks they should have or something like that. So a way of just saying, now this is what we're doing. We're asking questions just for the fun of it, just to make room for the questions. Then everyone feels way more comfortable. And I think it's an important thing to do, to not get caught in these biases or these one-sided perspective that it's only the same people raising their hand all the time. We need to make room for a more diverse conversation, and that could be a way to do it.
And I love and I say seeming simplicity of it, because I know how much time, research, and thought goes into that simple act that you're talking about.
It is very simple,
So,
that's true.
but it takes decades sometimes to break through that simplicity. Talk to me about Qvest.
Yeah, so Qvest is a bit more advanced of the question game tool I just told you about. So the basic logic in the tool is the same. So when I realized that we had this tendency to monopolize questions, I thought we needed something that would make it easier for more people to ask more questions. So it's a digital tool. It's for organizations, typically used in strategic transformation or digital transformations, where the people working in the organization needs to need to think differently, work differently, and paving the way while they're doing it. So preparing for a future where nobody really knows what's going to happen. Then it's a tool that can enable all the people working in the organization practicing talking about some of the big strategic topics, because typically it's something senior management, they are talking about the strategic topics, and then they expect someone else to execute or to implement the strategies. But having people discuss the same strategic topics at the same time can be extremely powerful, because then you have people trying to actually solve the same problems instead of running very different. So it's a way of aligning people. And the basic structure, as I said, is the same. So you invite, let's say, 300 people to have a conversation about this transformation the company is going through. You start on an individual level. So everyone starts by asking a question themselves. So I say, I want to ask Ken this question. I phrase my question, I write it. You receive a notification saying one of your colleagues asked you a question. And you respond, and then you get to ask a new question of another colleague. And it goes on for a work week, typically. So whenever it fits, working across time zones and different parts of the world, you just ask and answer question whenever it fits your program and your schedule. And then after a week, everyone receives a link to an output page where they can actually see a network visualization of how did we ask our questions, and what kind of questions did we ask? A word cloud where you can click, maybe there's a word saying change, or you're curious about change, so you click the word, and then you can see all the questions and answers that your colleagues exchanged about change. So it's a way of democratizing the curiosity and tapping into the curiosity and the eagerness to learn in the organization. So everybody has access to these insights. And then there's a lot of data analysis, of course, because looking at the questions people are asking provides insight that it's extremely difficult, if not to say impossible, to get in any other way. So knowing what are the questions people are asking enable you to make that data analysis that is very contextual. So you get to know what is it that this particular organization or this particular team, what is it that they need right now in order to take this transformation forward. So it's a flipping the logic with focusing on the questions rather than the answers when going through transformations.
So when you talk about that, I mean, I love it. I mean, you mentioned thinking differently. That's obviously a lot of what we do around human ingenuity. One of the challenges that I hear, though, is that for many companies, that's heresy. I mean, it's all about, we've all been taught about best practices, and best practices obviously are based on the past. And you are pushing people to think differently and to move to the future. Is it only a certain percentage of leaders, or small, like how do you start to break through that wall that organizations have built up for, I guess, for their own security and comfort?
It's a great question. It's a wonderful question. I think actually, yeah, we're at a point where it's the front runners, it's the people who maybe, and typically it's in large organizations actually. So it's organizations that have been trying out a lot, that have been doing it the regular ways, and then following the waterfall models or change management models. They have been trying out these things. And they, especially with the digital transformation and with all the things happening within technology, it's my impression that more and more leaders are realizing that they cannot, it's extremely difficult to prepare for what you don't know. So you have to find a way to trust that the people working in your organization, they know something that you don't. They talk to people that you don't talk to, with the customers, with each other. So they have some experience, that just the fact that it's different from your experience as in the leadership team makes it valuable. So the only way to figure out how can we see things from perspectives that we would otherwise not be able to see is to trust that people are able to ask questions that will bring in some new perspectives that we need in order to to make brave decisions, and in order to do things before all our competitors have done it. So I think it's probably not in all organizations, in all leadership teams. There are lots of organizations where you still, and there are also lots of industries where you need to do stuff in in a specific way and in particular order and stuff like that. But there are also a lot of industries realizing that we need to be able to have more people, invite more people to think aloud. We can not only trust the people who used to ask the question, who used to think, and who used to decide how to learn and where to go. We need to invite everyone. For instance, I did the Qvest tool was used in the part of the German auto company Audi in their paint shop. So it's 2,000 people, and the leader for this part of Audi, he was very eager to prepare his organization for the future, and at the same time he trusted his people very much. So he was, I know I have 2,000 people knowing things that I don't, and I need to know more about what's going on in my organization in order to help it evolve where it's already good, where it's already doing stuff that is this part of the future, and for the organization to help itself adjust and align on the things that really can make a difference. So he used the Qvest tool, but he also used a lot of time, spent a lot of time in preparing the leadership team and preparing everyone around to make room and to trust these questions and to trust to do it differently. So of course it takes courage, and it takes willingness to change your own mind as a leader as well.
And as you talk about that, I mean, I guess the last 30 minutes, it's short, but it's quick. But the overriding word it's going through my mind is empathy. That we're building empathy for others and for the world and for our impact on it. And that is really, I mean, one of the key things today that separates human ingenuity from artificial intelligence, or what I think one day will be artificial ingenuity. So, yeah, empathy. Is that one of the critical outcomes?
I definitely think it is. Yes, I think it is.
So, been an absolute pleasure. We've been talking today with Pia Lauritzen, philosopher, writer, founder of Qvest. Just before we go, I haven't had a chance to read the book, but tell us a little bit about the book Questions and some of the major takeaways for people who want to, start somewhere after hearing this.
Yeah, so Questions is a very short book. It's easy to I think you can read it in a few hours, but it's also very ambitious in the sense that I really wanted to explore questions from the very beginning. So I start out by asking, who asked the first question in the history of mankind? And that's a very difficult question to answer because there are no records and there are no scientific reports. So I actually went back to the Bible, and the very first, how is the beginning? Who asked the first question according to the creation story? I don't know. Do you know that, Ken? Do you know who asked the first question? Yeah, you do.
I do not.
You do not. No, I didn't either, and I was surprised. So the very first question, it just kicked off so many aspects of understanding what is our role as human beings, why do we ask questions, and following throughout history from very early days to see how did it evolve. Do we use questions differently in different parts of the world? That was a huge part of my postdoctoral studies. I can tell you we do ask questions, use questions in very different ways. We all use questions to distribute responsibility. So you can also hear it in the wording, to pose a question and to take a position and to give a response and to take responsibility. So there is a connection here between questions and how we distribute responsibility, but we do it very differently in different parts of the world. So it leads to a lot of confusion. I also look into the language, have different ways of phrasing questions, and what does that mean, and why do children ask questions and way more questions than adults do. And so it's literally a journey from the very beginning, from Adam and Eve up until my own kids. What is it that these questions, how do they work, and how do they impact the way we think and behave as human beings? So it's a very ambitious book, but it's short, and I would love to hear what you think if you read it.
Well, I've ordered it. Unfortunately, it didn't get here in time for this, but I will absolutely do that. And it's funny, I would have guessed that Eve asked the first question.
Yeah,
Being
but she
more inquisitive
didn't.
traditionally than no. Okay.
No. No, I'm not sure whether I should. I think you should read it and then let me know what you think.
I will read it and then we can do a follow-up. So
Yeah, that would be
Pia
great.
Lauritzen, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today.
I enjoyed it very much too. Thank you so much for having me.